Blood stained his left cuff. Spreadsheets filled her hands. Dante Costa didn't do apologies, and he certainly didn't do compromises. So when a botched deal in Chicago left the ruthless syndicate boss and his fiercely competent secretary stranded in a sold-out city, the rules shattered. They had one hotel room, one single bed. He was a man accustomed to taking absolutely whatever he wanted. But when the heavy door clicked shut, the most dangerous man in the city simply pointed to the mattress. Rain hammered against the tinted windows of the Lincoln Navigator, distorting the neon signs of downtown Chicago into smeared, bleeding colors. Tessa Hayes sat in the back seat, her posture rigidly straight, a glowing tablet resting on her knees. She didn't look at the man sitting 2 feet to her left. She didn't need to. The suffocating tension radiating from him was enough to make the air in the spacious cabin feel painfully thin. Dante Costa was silent. He usually was after a negotiation turned violent. Tessa kept her eyes fixed on the quarterly earnings projections for one of his shell corporations. Her thumb swiped down the screen. Swipe, read, swipe. It was a grounding mechanism, a way to ignore the metallic scent of copper lingering in the confined space, mingling with the expensive sandalwood of Dante's cologne. He shifted, his large frame pressing against the leather interior. He brought a hand to his jaw, rubbing the tight muscles there. A bruised knuckle caught the passing streetlights. "Reroute us," Dante said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. It held no trace of the smooth, charismatic businessman he played for the cameras. Tessa didn't blink. "O'Hare is closed, Mr. Costa. The storm system stalled over the lake. Every flight out of the city is grounded until tomorrow morning. Find a private strip. Call Rossi. Tell him to get the Gulf Stream in the air." "I already did," Tessa replied, her tone perfectly even, the voice of a woman who had spent 4 years surviving in the shadow of a monster by being 10 steps ahead of him. "Midway is grounded. DuPage is grounded. The crosswinds are exceeding 50 knots. Unless you want the jets scattered across Lake Michigan, we are staying in Chicago tonight." Dante turned his head slowly, his dark eyes, usually flat and unreadable, locked onto her profile. Tessa forced herself not to shrink back. She knew the golden rule of surviving Dante Costa: never show fear, and never waste his time. "Then find a hotel," he muttered, looking back out the window. "That," Tessa said, her fingers finally stilling on the glass screen, "is proving difficult. The International Tech Expo is in town. Combine that with 70 cancelled flights, and every 5-star, 4-star, and 3-star establishment within a 30-mile radius is completely booked." "Tessa." He rarely used her first name. It was always a warning. "I am not sleeping in a car. I am aware. I've been on the phone with 3 concierges. I secured a room at the Drake." Dante grunted, pulling at the knot of his silk tie. "Fine. There's a caveat." He stopped, his hands dropping to his lap. He looked at her again, waiting. "It was a cancellation. The last available room in the building. It's a standard suite." Tessa swallowed, fighting to keep her voice professional. "With one king-size bed." The silence returned, heavier this time. Tessa felt a cold bead of sweat roll down her spine beneath her tailored blouse. She managed his schedule, his meetings, his dry cleaning, and occasionally the cleanup crews. She did not share sleeping quarters with him. She knew what he was. She knew the bodies buried beneath the foundations of his legitimate empire. You didn't get close to a man like Dante without risking getting burned, and sharing a room crossed a boundary she had meticulously maintained for 48 months. "Book it," he said simply. "I could stay at a motel further out," Tessa offered quickly. "I can catch a cab, and you can take the—" "I said book it." Dante's tone brooked no argument. You aren't wandering around the south side at 2 in the morning looking for a vacancy sign. Not tonight. Not when the Morellos know we're in town. The unspoken threat hung in the air. The meeting today had been with the Morello family. The blood on his cuff belonged to one of their lieutenants. She was a civilian, technically. But in this world, technicalities rarely stopped a bullet. Tessa nodded once, brisk and efficient. It's already confirmed. The rest of the drive was spent in utter silence. The city blurred past them, a sprawling grid of wet concrete and flashing lights. Tessa's mind raced, calculating logistics, drafting tomorrow's apology emails for missed meetings, and desperately trying to ignore the reality of the next 8 hours. She was exhausted. Her feet ached in her sensible pumps, and a dull headache throbbed behind her eyes. When the SUV finally pulled under the ornate awning of the hotel, the doorman rushed forward with an umbrella. Dante stepped out first, ignoring the rain, his broad shoulders easily shaking off the chill. Tessa followed, clutching her leather briefcase to her chest like a shield. The lobby was a chaotic mess of stranded travelers and frustrated business people. Dante bypassed the lines, his presence parting the crowd like a ship cutting through icy water. People didn't know who he was, but they instinctively moved out of his way. Predators recognized predators, and prey knew to scatter. Tessa handled the desk clerk. She handed over the corporate card, signed the forms, and took the single plastic keycard. Dante stood a few feet away, his back to her, watching the doors. He was scanning for threats. He was always scanning. "Ready," she said, quietly, stepping up beside him. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked toward the elevators. Tessa followed in his wake, her sensible heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The elevator ride to the 16th floor took an eternity. The mirrored walls of the cab reflected their stark contrast. Dante, imposing, bruised, radiating a dark, kinetic energy. Tessa, neat, pale, holding herself together with sheer willpower and caffeine. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. They stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. Tessa looked at the keycard. Room 1604. She walked to the heavy mahogany door, tapped the plastic card against the reader. A small green light flashed, accompanied by a sharp click. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dark room, feeling the sudden, terrifying shift in their dynamic. The professional buffer of desks and office walls was gone. Fluorescent streetlights cut through the sheer curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the carpet. Tessa reached out, flicking the wall switch. Heavy lamps illuminated the room in a warm, amber glow. It was a beautiful room. High ceilings, crown molding, a small sitting area with a velvet sofa, and occupying the center of the space, dominating the room like an accusation, was a massive king-size bed, piled high with stark white pillows. Tessa stopped dead in the entryway. She gripped her briefcase handle until her knuckles turned white. Dante stepped in behind her. He kicked the door shut with the heel of his Oxford shoe. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room, sounding entirely too final. He walked past her, tossing his expensive wool coat over the back of a desk chair. He rolled his shoulders, a grimace flickering across his bruised face. "Bathroom's yours first," he said, not looking at her. He moved to the small minibar, tearing open a bottle of sparkling water and downing half of it in one go. Tessa didn't move. She stared at the bed. "Mr. Costa." He paused, the glass bottle hovering near his lips. He turned slowly. He looked tired. Deeply, intrinsically tired. The dangerous edge that usually surrounded him was blunted by exhaustion, leaving behind a man who looked like he had been carrying a building on his back for 10 years. "Tessa," he sighed, the harshness gone from his voice. "We are both dead on our feet. Wash your face. Go to sleep." "There is one bed." "I have eyes. I can sleep on the sofa, she said quickly, moving toward the velvet couch. It was small. Too small for him. Barely long enough for her. I don't need much space. I can just... stop. The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken quietly, but it carried the absolute weight of a command. Tessa froze. Dante set the water bottle down on the granite counter with a soft clink. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt, rolling the sleeves up to his forearms. The dark ink of his tattoos contrasted sharply with his pale skin. You manage my life, Dante said, his voice flat but carrying a strange current beneath it. You intercept federal subpoenas, you handle my brother's gambling debts, and you keep me from killing the board of directors on a weekly basis. You work 80 hours a week. He stepped away from the minibar, walking slowly toward her. You do not sleep on a fucking couch. Tessa swallowed hard, maintaining eye contact. It's inappropriate. Dante let out a short, humorless laugh. Inappropriate? Tessa, I am under federal investigation for racketeering. I beat a man unconscious 3 hours ago because he tried to skim from the ports. Do you really think I give a damn about HR protocols right now? It's not about protocols, she shot back, her professional mask slipping just a fraction, revealing the frantic exhaustion beneath. It's about boundaries. It's about survival. He stopped a few feet away from her. The height difference was staggering up close. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the faint purple bags under her eyes, the rigid set of her shoulders. I'm not going to touch you, he said. The words were simple, stark, and utterly devoid of deception. I am a bastard, Tessa. I am a criminal. But I am not a monster to the people who keep me breathing, and you keep me breathing. He pointed a long, calloused finger at the mattress. Get in the bed. Where are you going to sleep? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Dante looked over at the small velvet sofa. He walked over to the bed, grabbed one of the thick pillows and a spare blanket folded at the foot of the mattress. I've slept on concrete floors, Tessa. A velvet couch is a luxury. You won't fit. I'll manage. He tossed the pillow onto one end of the couch. Tessa watched him, a complicated knot tightening in her chest. She had spent years viewing him through a lens of calculated detachment. He was the boss, the danger, the paycheck. But watching this massive, violent man meticulously arrange a blanket on a tiny couch just so she could have a mattress, it cracked the foundation of everything she thought she knew about him. 15 minutes, Dante said, pulling his tie completely off and throwing it onto a chair. Then the lights go out. Tessa didn't argue anymore. She walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She washed her face, staring at her own reflection in the mirror. She looked terrified, but strangely safe. It made no sense. She was locked in a room with a Mafia boss, yet it was the most protected she had felt in years. When she emerged, wearing a clean, oversized t-shirt she always kept in her carry-on, the room was dark. The only light came from the city glow filtering through the curtains. She walked quietly to the bed, pulling back the heavy duvet. She slid in. The sheets were cold and crisp. Across the room, she heard the rustle of fabric. Dante was already on the couch, his long legs bent awkwardly, a dark silhouette against the window. Tessa lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. The silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer suffocating. It was filled with the rhythmic sound of rain beating against the glass. "Mr. Costa," she whispered into the dark, not knowing why she spoke. A long pause. Then a low rumble from the couch. "It's Dante, Tessa. Off the clock, it's Dante." She closed her eyes, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Good night, Dante." She heard him shift, trying to find comfort on the small piece of furniture. "Sleep, Tessa. "I've got the door," and for the first time in 4 years, Tessa Hayes closed her eyes and let her guard completely down, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep, guarded by the worst man she knew. Grey light filtered through the sheer curtains, painting the hotel room in muted, clinical tones. Tessa woke to the absolute silence of the suite. For a fractured second, her brain scrambled to identify the unfamiliar ceiling, the smell of bleach and stale rain, the heavy, expensive duvet pooling at her waist. Then the memories of the previous night slammed into her. The botched meeting, the blood, the drive. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. The velvet sofa across the room was empty. The pillow was tossed haphazardly over the armrest, the blanket folded into a neat, militant square. Tessa pushed her hair out of her eyes and swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. The carpet was cold against her bare feet. A sharp hiss of breath echoed from the half-open bathroom door. Tessa froze. She crept forward, her toes sinking into the plush rug, and gently pushed the heavy wooden door open another inch. Dante sat on the closed toilet seat. He had stripped off his ruined dress shirt. His broad back was to her, a landscape of corded muscle, faded scars, and dark, sprawling tattoos that snaked up his neck. But it wasn't the ink that caught her attention. It was the massive, blooming bruise wrapping around his left ribcage, a violent mural of purple, black, and angry yellow. He held a roll of white athletic tape in his teeth, his right hand struggling to pull it taut around his torso. His left arm hung rigidly at his side, trembling slightly from the effort of simply existing. Tessa didn't announce herself. She didn't apologize for intruding. 4 years of working for a predator had taught her that hesitation was a liability. She walked into the bathroom, the cool tiles biting her soles, and stepped directly in front of him. Dante's head snapped up. His dark eyes flared, a pure, instinctual flash of violence that made her breath catch before the recognition settled in and the fire banked down into something guarded. He took the tape out of his mouth. "I woke you," he said. It wasn't a question. "You're fracturing a rib trying to do that yourself," she replied, her voice remarkably steady. She reached out. "Give it to me." He looked at her outstretched hand. He looked at her face, completely devoid of makeup, her hair a messy knot, swimming in her oversized grey t-shirt. For a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the state, he looked entirely out of his depth. "Tessa, go back to bed. I'm fine." "You are breathing like a winded horse, and your left hand is shaking. You aren't fine." She didn't withdraw her hand. "Give me the tape, Dante." It was the second time she had used his first name. It hung in the sterile, brightly lit bathroom, heavy and intimate. Dante's jaw clenched. Slowly, reluctantly, he handed her the roll of tape. Tessa stepped between his spread knees. The proximity was staggering. She could feel the heat radiating off his bare skin, smell the remnants of sandalwood masking the sharp tang of sweat and copper. She kept her eyes focused entirely on his bruised side, refusing to look at his face, refusing to acknowledge the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart against her knuckles. "Lift your left arm," she instructed softly. He obeyed with a grimace. Tessa unrolled the tape, her small, cool fingers anchoring the sticky white strip against his pale skin. She wrapped it firmly around his torso, leaning in to pull it tight across his back. Her chest brushed his shoulder. Dante went utterly still. The air in the small bathroom suddenly felt thick, heavy with an electric charge that made the hairs on Tessa's arms stand up. "Who hit you?" she asked quietly, her focus glued to the task. "Wrap, pull, smooth." "Vinnie Morello," Dante rasped. His voice sounded like it was being dragged through crushed glass. He brought a bat to a contract dispute. Did you kill him? It was a sterile question. She asked it with the same tone she used to ask if he wanted his coffee black. No. Dante looked down at her. She could feel his gaze burning into the top of her head. But he won't be swinging a bat again for a very long time. Tessa secured the end of the tape, smoothing it flat against his sternum. Her fingers lingered there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She felt the sharp intake of his breath beneath her palm. She pulled her hands back quickly, taking a half step away. "That should hold until we get back and Dr. Evans can look at it," she said, her voice dropping back into its familiar, professional cadence. She turned to the sink, aggressively washing her hands with the cheap hotel soap. Dante stood up. He towered over her in the confined space. "You didn't flinch?" Tessa grabbed a small towel and dried her hands. At what? The blood. The bruise. The fact that your boss is a thug who settles boardroom disputes with his knuckles. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her through narrowed eyes. Most people flinch, Tessa. She finally looked at him. She looked past the bruises, past the cold, dead-eyed stare he used to terrify his rivals. She saw the man who had slept on a 3-foot velvet sofa, so she could feel safe. "I'm not most people, Mr. Costa," she said, tossing the towel onto the counter. "Now get dressed. I need to find us a car to O'Hare, and I am not doing it before I've had coffee." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his bare arm. Dante didn't move for a long time. He just watched her walk back into the room, a complicated, dangerous realization settling heavily in his chest. O'Hare's private terminal was eerily empty, a sterile vacuum of polished floors and reinforced glass. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a bitter, biting wind that whipped across the tarmac. Tessa sat in the leather lounge chair, her tablet humming back to life as it connected to the airport Wi-Fi. Notifications flooded the screen. 6 missed calls from the board. 14 urgent emails from legal. She began sorting them, her fingers flying across the glass, slipping effortlessly back into the machine she was built to be. But the rhythm felt off. The armor didn't fit right anymore. Dante sat across from her, a fresh, black, button-down shirt masking the taped ribs. He held a cup of black coffee, but he wasn't drinking it. He was watching her. It wasn't his usual fleeting, observational glance. It was heavy, calculating. "Cancel the 2 o'clock with the union reps," Dante ordered quietly. Tessa swiped the meeting off the calendar without looking up. "Done. I'll push them to Thursday. Cancel Thursday too. Cancel everything this week that requires me to leave the tower." Tessa's fingers paused. She looked up, her brow furrowing. Dante Costa did not hide. When the syndicate smelled blood in the water, he usually went on the offensive, walking into restaurants and boardrooms to remind everyone exactly who owned the city. Hiding in his penthouse was a sign of weakness. "Are the Morellos retaliating?" she asked, keeping her voice low. A baggage handler was buffing the floor 50 yards away, but she took no chances. "They will try." Dante set his coffee down. "Vinny is the underboss's nephew. They can't let it slide without looking weak. It's going to get loud in Chicago for a few weeks. I'll coordinate with security. We can double your detail." "I already did." Dante leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The movement clearly pulled at his ribs, but his face remained a mask of stone. "But the detail isn't just for me." Tessa blinked. "I don't understand." "You aren't going back to your apartment in Lincoln Park, Tessa." The gravel in his voice was back, authoritative and absolute. "Rossi is sending a team to pack your things. You're moving into the guest suite in my penthouse." The tablet nearly slipped from her grasp. She stared at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. I am your executive assistant. Tessa said, her voice rising in pitch, the carefully constructed professional wall cracking down the center. I am an employee. I have a cat. I have a life. You cannot just order me to move into your home. I just did. No. Tessa stood up. She grabbed her briefcase, her knuckles turning white. I handle your schedules, Dante. I handle your paperwork. I do not get involved in the street wars. I am a civilian. Dante stood up slowly, matching her height, his presence suffocating the space between them. You think the Morellos care about HR classifications, Tessa? You think they care that you only handle spreadsheets? He stepped closer. You are the gatekeeper to my entire life. You know the accounts. You know the routing numbers. You know where I am every second of every day. I have been doing this for 4 years, she fired back, refusing to back down, tilting her chin up to glare into his dark, furious eyes. I have never been a target before. Before I didn't care, he snarled. The words echoed in the empty lounge. The silence that followed was deafening. The baggage handler stopped buffing the floor. The coffee in the paper cup stopped steaming. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Tessa stared at him, her chest heaving. The implication hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. Before I didn't care. Dante didn't break eye contact. The cold, ruthless mob boss was gone, replaced by a man staring down a terrifying vulnerability. He had spent his entire life building fortresses, eliminating weaknesses, turning himself into a man who needed nothing and no one. And overnight, in a cramped hotel room on a velvet couch, he had realized his greatest liability was standing right in front of him, armed with a tablet and a sensible pair of heels. They won't come at me directly, Dante said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I have too much muscle. They will look for the softest target, closest to me. They will look to hurt me by taking something I value. Tessa swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. Dante, you are moving into the penthouse, Tessa. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently wrapping around her wrist. His thumb brushed over her pulse point. It was racing. I can protect you there. I can see you. I won't let you out of my sight until Vinnie Morello and his uncle are buried under the foundations of the new casino. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. The touch was light, but it felt like a steel trap snapping shut. She knew exactly what she was agreeing to if she nodded. It wasn't just a change of address. It was stepping out of the shadows and directly into the crosshairs of his world. It was crossing a line that could never, ever be uncrossed. What about my cat? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The tension broke. A small, genuine, incredibly rare smile pulled at the corner of Dante's bruised mouth. The cat comes too, he said softly. Tessa let out a shaky breath, the fight draining out of her. She didn't pull her wrist away. Fine, but I am keeping my own hours, and I am not making your breakfast. Deal. Dante stepped back, releasing her wrist, but the brand of his touch remained on her skin. He turned toward the reinforced glass doors leading to the tarmac. Come on. The jet is ready. Tessa picked up her briefcase. She looked around the sterile terminal one last time, mourning the quiet, uncomplicated life she was leaving behind. Then she turned and followed Dante Costa out into the cold, walking willingly into the storm. Sunlight reflected off the bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows, casting harsh geometric shapes across the Italian marble of the kitchen. Tessa stood completely still, clutching a bag of premium chicken liver kibble to her chest. She was standing in the center of a $60 million fortress in the sky, and she felt entirely out of her depth. Barnaby, an overweight orange tabby who possessed zero self-preservation instincts, wove between her ankles, letting out a demanding yowl. He didn't care that they were currently hiding from a violent organized crime syndicate. He only cared that it was past 8 a.m. and his ceramic bowl was empty. Tessa knelt, the silk of her tailored trousers pulling taut, and poured the food. The sound of dry kibble hitting ceramic was jarring in the absolute, suffocating silence of Dante Costa's penthouse. "You brought the beast." She flinched, snapping her head up. Dante stood in the archway of the kitchen. He wore grey sweatpants and a black t-shirt that stretched tight over the bandages wrapping his ribs. His hair was messy, hanging slightly over his forehead, stripping away the polished veneer he wore to board meetings. He looked raw, dangerous, and deeply domestic. "His name is Barnaby," Tessa said, standing up and smoothing her blouse. She retreated behind the massive granite island, instinctively putting a barrier between them. "And you said I could bring him. If he's an issue, I can arrange for a boarding facility." Dante walked into the kitchen, his bare feet making no sound on the marble. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on the cat. Barnaby, possessing the loyalty of a mercenary, immediately abandoned his food and trotted over to the 6'3" mob boss. The cat head-butted Dante's ankle, purring like a broken diesel engine. Tessa held her breath. She had seen Dante break a man's jaw with a glass ashtray without blinking. Slowly, wincing slightly as his bruised ribs protested, Dante crouched down. He extended a massive, tattooed hand. Barnaby sniffed his knuckles, then aggressively rubbed his cheek against the heavy silver ring on Dante's index finger. Dante stroked the cat's head once, a brief, surprisingly gentle motion, before standing back up. "He stays," Dante said, walking to the commercial-grade espresso machine. "But if he scratches the leather sofas in the screening room, we're going to have a problem." "Noted." Tessa swallowed, her throat dry. She grabbed her tablet from the counter, desperately needing to anchor herself to her job. "I have the revised quarterly reports. I also rerouted the offshore transfers through the Cayman shells, as requested. The legal team needs your signature on the union contracts by noon, or we lose the port leverage." Dante ground the espresso beans. The mechanical whir filled the silence. "Email the contracts to Rossi. He's downstairs with the security detail. He'll bring them up. I can take them down. You aren't leaving this floor, Tessa. It's an elevator ride." Dante turned. The casual domestic energy vanished, instantly replaced by the suffocating weight of the man who ran Chicago's underworld. He rested his hands on the granite counter, leaning his weight forward. "Vinnie Morello is breathing through a tube at Chicago Med," Dante said, his voice deadly quiet. "His uncle has put a bounty on the man who put him there. And since they can't get to me, they are looking for leverage. They are looking for a weakness. I am an employee," she repeated, the same desperate mantra she had used at the airport. "You are the woman who knows the codes to the vault. You are the woman who knows the names of the judges on my payroll. You are the woman who slept in my hotel room." Dante's dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away her defenses layer by layer. "In their eyes, you belong to me. And in my world, taking what belongs to your enemy is how you start a war." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "What belongs to me?" Tessa gripped the edges of her tablet until her fingers cramped. She was a master of logistics, a genius at compartmentalization. For 4 years, she had balanced the legitimate empire against the blood-soaked reality of how it was built. She had never let the two worlds bleed together, but standing in his kitchen, wearing the clothes his security team had packed for her, listening to him claim her as a piece on his chessboard, the walls finally collapsed. "I didn't sign up for this," she whispered, the professional mask finally cracking. Her voice shook, just a fraction. "I signed up to manage your calendar, Dante, not to be a target." He stared at her for a long time. The harsh lines of his face softened, just barely. He pushed away from the counter and walked around the island. Tessa didn't step back. She held her ground as he stopped mere inches from her. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His proximity alone was a physical weight. "I know," he said, his voice dropping into a rough, quiet register. "And when this is over, you can walk away. You can hand in your resignation, take your cat, and disappear. I will fund your life anywhere in the world. But right now, you stay in this cage, because it is the only place I know I can keep you breathing." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, taking his espresso with him. Tessa stood alone in the brilliant morning light, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrifyingly aware that she didn't want to walk away at all. Static cracked through the encrypted radio sitting on the glass dining table. It was 2:14 a.m. Tessa sat on the velvet sofa in the darkened living room, a glowing laptop resting on her knees. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. The penthouse was entirely soundproof, a sealed tomb hovering 80 stories above the city. The silence was maddening. It left too much room for her mind to spin, calculating the brutal mathematics of gang warfare. The radio crackled again. "Boss, you awake?" It was Rossi. His voice was tight. Urgency bled through the encrypted channel. Before Tessa could reach for the receiver, a shadow moved in the hallway. Dante emerged from the dark, wearing black tactical pants and a tight, dark Henley. He moved with a predatory grace that betrayed zero signs of his broken ribs. He snatched the radio off the table. "I'm here," Dante said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Report." "We checked the Lincoln Park address," Rossi said over the static. "Like you asked." Tessa froze. Lincoln Park, her apartment. Dante didn't look at her. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering wildly beneath his bruised skin. "And?" "Door was kicked in. Deadbolt shattered. They tore the place down to the studs, Dante. Slashed the mattress, ripped the plumbing out of the walls. They were looking for a safe or a go bag. When they didn't find one, they left a message." A heavy, sickening pause filled the room. They nailed a dead canary to the bedroom door. Tessa stopped breathing. The laptop slid off her knees, hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. The sound of her own blood rushing in her ears drowned out the faint hum of the city below. They had been in her home. They had stood in her bedroom. If Dante hadn't forced her onto that plane, if he hadn't dragged her into his fortress, she would have been asleep on that mattress when the door gave way. Dante slowly lowered the radio. The silence in the penthouse stretched, pulling tight like piano wire ready to snap. He finally turned his head to look at her. The man standing across the room was no longer the CEO of Costa Holdings. The polished executive was dead. The man staring at her now was the ruthless, terrifying apex predator of the Chicago underworld. His eyes were black, flat, and completely devoid of humanity. "Get my gear," Dante commanded into the radio, not breaking eye contact with Tessa. "Assemble the strike team in the basement garage. 5 minutes." "Copy that." "Target?" "The Morello warehouse on 43rd. Dante's voice was utterly emotionless. "We burn it to the concrete." "Dante, no!" Tessa was on her feet before she even realized she had moved. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to walk toward him. "You can't. That's an escalation. If you hit their warehouse, the commission will get involved. It will be an open war on the streets. It is already a war." He tossed the radio onto the sofa. He walked to a biometric safe embedded in the wall behind a painting. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. The steel door hissed open. "They were trying to scare you," Tessa pleaded, closing the distance between them. "They want you to react blindly. It's a provocation." Dante reached into the safe. The heavy metallic clack of a magazine, sliding into a Glock 19, echoed in the cavernous room. He racked the slide. The sound was horribly final. He turned, shoving the weapon into a holster at the small of his back. "They stood in your bedroom, Tessa." He stepped into her space, towering over her. The scent of gun oil and sandalwood enveloped her. "They put a knife through the bed where you sleep. Do you understand what that means? They didn't go there to scare me. They went there to put a bullet in the back of your head to send me a message." Tessa's breath hitched. She looked up into his face, searching for a trace of the man who had gently petted her cat hours earlier. He was gone, buried beneath a cold, terrifying rage. "Let Rossi handle it," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached out, grabbing the fabric of his shirt. It was a desperate, foolish gesture, but she couldn't stop herself. "You're injured. You don't have to do this yourself." Dante looked down at her small, pale hands, gripping his dark shirt. Slowly, he reached up, wrapping his large hand over hers. He didn't pull her away. He just held her hand against his chest, right over his violently beating heart. "There are rules to this life," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "You don't touch family. You don't touch civilians. And you never, ever touch what is mine." They crossed the line. "If I send Rossi, it's business. If I go myself, it's a consequence." He let go of her hand, stepping back. The brief moment of connection was severed, leaving Tessa feeling cold and exposed. "Lock the doors," Dante ordered, walking toward the private elevator. "Do not answer the radio unless you hear my voice. If anyone else tries to come through those doors, you take the sidearm from the kitchen safe and you shoot through the wood. Do you understand me?" "Dante, do you understand me, Tessa?" The command cracked through the room like a whip. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat and nodded once. "Yes." "Good." The elevator door slid open. He stepped inside, turning to face her one last time before the doors closed. He didn't say goodbye. He just let the steel doors slide shut, sealing her in the quiet, gilded cage, while he went down into the dark to burn the city for her. Smoke from the south side wouldn't physically reach the 80th floor, but Tessa swore the acrid scent of ash clung to the back of her throat. Hours bled into one another. 3 in the morning shifted to 4, then crept agonizingly toward 5. She paced the length of the living room until her bare feet ached, wearing an invisible path into the priceless Persian rug. Barnaby slept on the velvet sofa, entirely unbothered by the fact that the city beneath them was currently being torn apart. She booted up her encrypted laptop. She wasn't checking emails or drafting memos. She was monitoring police scanners. Tessa cross-referenced dispatch codes, her tired eyes scanning rapidly scrolling lines of text on a dark screen. 10:33, emergency in progress. 10:70, fire alarm. The address was 43rd and Halstead, the Morello warehouse. It was burning. The digital voices of the dispatchers sounded frantic, cutting through the static. Multiple explosions reported. Structural collapse imminent. She closed the laptop sharply. The silence of the soundproof penthouse returned. It was worse now. Knowing he was out there, in the center of that inferno, orchestrating chaos because of a slashed mattress and a dead bird. Doing it for her. At 5:12 a.m., the private elevator chimed. Tessa froze. She remembered his order. Take the sidearm from the kitchen safe and shoot through the wood. She didn't move toward the kitchen. She couldn't feel her legs. Her heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft hiss. Dante stepped out. He didn't look like the polished CEO of Costa Holdings, and he didn't look like the cold, calculating Mafia boss who had left hours ago. He looked like a casualty of war. His dark Henley was torn at the shoulder, soaked in something thick and black that smelled violently of gasoline, smoke, and copper. Heavy soot stained his face, masking his bruised jaw. He was leaning heavily to his left, favoring the ribs he had taped earlier. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. Rossi stepped out behind him, carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. The enforcer looked equally battered, a fresh cut bleeding freely down his temple, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the penthouse before landing on Tessa. He would go to the clinic, Rossi said, his voice flat. He dropped the canvas bag onto the marble floor. It landed with a heavy metallic clank. Said the doctor comes here, or he patches himself up. Dante waved Rossi off with a bloody, trembling hand. Get out. Go ground the men. Pay off the beat cops on Halstead before the feds show up. Dante, Rossi started, taking a step forward. Now, Rossi. It was a growl, low and feral, scraping the bottom of his lungs. Rossi nodded once, stepping back into the elevator. The doors closed, leaving them alone. Dante swayed on his feet. He took one step toward the living room and staggered, his knee buckling beneath him. Tessa moved before she consciously made the decision to do so. She crossed the room in seconds, wedging her shoulder under his right arm, bracing her small frame against his massive weight just before he hit the hardwood floor. He groaned, and a harsh, guttural sound of agony that ripped through the quiet room. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, anchored by pure adrenaline. "I've got you. Walk." She practically dragged him to the oversized leather armchair near the window. He collapsed into it, his head tipping back against the upholstery. He closed his eyes. His skin was pale beneath the soot, a sickly, ashen grey. Tessa knelt beside the chair. Her hands hovered over him, unsure where to touch, terrified of making it worse. The metallic smell of blood was overwhelming now. It wasn't just on his shirt. It was painted across his knuckles, soaked into his tactical pants. "Where are you hit?" she demanded. She slipped back into her executive assistant persona, because it was the only way she knew how to survive a crisis. Assess the damage, mitigate the fallout. "Dante, look at me. Are you shot?" He opened his eyes. The whites were completely bloodshot, the dark irises dilated. He looked down at her, his gaze wandering over her face, taking in her messy hair, her pale skin, the frantic terror hiding just behind her professional mask. "Not shot," he rasped. He lifted his right hand, wiping a smear of blood across his forehead. "Just close proximity to a blast radius. And I think a beam clipped my shoulder on the way out." "I'm calling Dr. Evans," she said, reaching into her pocket for her phone. His hand shot out, moving with terrifying speed despite his injuries. His bloody fingers clamped around her wrist. "No, no doctors. Not tonight. Evans is on the payroll, but he talks to the capos. If the commission knows I'm crippled, they strike tomorrow morning. I have to look invincible by sunrise." "You are bleeding on a $60,000 chair," Tessa shot back. Her fear manifested as sharp, cynical anger. "You are not invincible, Dante. You are a biological organism currently leaking fluid. Let go of my wrist." He let go, his hand dropping heavily to his lap. A ghost of a smirk pulled at his cracked, bleeding lips. Always the pragmatist, Tessa. "Somebody has to be," she muttered, standing up. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not bleed on the rug. I am getting the trauma kit." She ran to the master bathroom, hauling out the massive military-grade medical bag his security team kept stocked under the sink. When she returned, his eyes were closed again. His breathing was frighteningly shallow. She dropped the kit onto the floor and unzipped it, pulling out trauma shears, thick gauze pads, and a bottle of surgical-grade antiseptic. "Shirt off," she ordered. He didn't argue. He grasped the hem of his ruined Henley and pulled. The movement tore a sharp hiss from his lips. The fabric stuck to his left shoulder, glued by coagulated blood. Tessa reached out, batting his hands away. "Stop! You're tearing the skin!" She took the shears. "Hold still." She cut the heavy fabric away, slicing up the seam until the ruined shirt fell to the floor. The damage was extensive. The athletic tape around his ribs was black with soot. A massive, jagged laceration crossed his left deltoid, oozing dark blood. His chest was covered in minor burns, scrapes, and a blooming constellation of new bruises. Tessa poured antiseptic onto a thick pad of gauze. "This is going to burn. I've had worse," he muttered, bracing his hands on the armrests. She pressed the gauze directly into the laceration. Dante didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. His entire body just went completely rigid, the muscles locking into iron. His jaw clenched so hard, she heard his teeth grind. She cleaned the wound with ruthless efficiency, refusing to let her hands shake. She wasn't just his secretary anymore. She was the woman keeping him from bleeding out in his own living room. "Warehouse?" she asked quietly, taping a heavy pressure dressing over his shoulder. "Gone," Dante managed to say, his voice strained and breathless. "Nothing left but concrete and ash. The Morellos won't be shipping anything through the south side for a decade." Tessa sat back on her heels, dropping the bloody gauze into a plastic waste bag. She looked at the destruction mapped across his body, the brutal physical toll of his lifestyle. Was it worth it? Dante finally looked at her. The cold, dead-eyed killer from the radio was gone. The exhaustion had stripped him down to his barest, most volatile foundations. He looked at her hands, stained with his blood. He looked at the tears she was desperately fighting to keep out of her eyes. "They put a knife in your bed, Tessa," he whispered. He leaned forward slightly, ignoring the agony in his ribs, ensuring she heard every single syllable. "I would have burned the entire city down to the bedrock for that. The warehouse was a compromise." Tessa stared at him. The clinical detachment she had clung to for 4 years, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He meant it. Every single word. He was a monster, a criminal, a man capable of unspeakable violence, and he had just weaponized all of it to ensure she felt safe. It was terrifying. It was utterly toxic. And God help her, it was the most profoundly moving thing anyone had ever done for her. She didn't reply. She couldn't. Instead, she picked up a clean, damp towel from the kit and gently began wiping the soot from his bruised jaw, her touch feather-light against the darkness of his world. Sunlight finally broke over Lake Michigan, flooding the penthouse with a harsh, unforgiving glare. It exposed the brutal reality of the night, the bloody rags on the floor, the ruined tactical gear piled in the corner, the heavy exhaustion etched deep into Dante's face. Tessa sat on the edge of the glass coffee table, her knees practically brushing his dark trousers. He was patched up. The bleeding had stopped, leaving behind an aching stiffness that made every breath a battle. Dante hadn't moved from the leather armchair. He was watching her pack away the remaining medical supplies with meticulous precision. She lined up the iodine bottles, zipped the nylon pouches, and snapped the latches shut. It was a desperate attempt to control an utterly uncontrollable environment. "You missed a spot," Dante said quietly, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation. Tessa froze. She looked up, her hands hovering over the trauma kit. "Where?" He reached out slowly, his fingers, calloused, scraped, and smelling faintly of bleach, brushed against her left cheekbone. The touch was incredibly gentle, a stark, jarring contrast to the violence he had unleashed only hours before. He wiped away a smudge of ash that had transferred from his skin to hers. "There," he murmured, dropping his hand back to his thigh. Tessa swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of the suffocating intimacy of the space. The penthouse was massive. yet the oxygen felt entirely depleted. "I need to call legal," she said, her voice sounding a little too loud, a little too frantic in the quiet room. She stood up, grabbing her tablet from the side table. "If the warehouse burned, the authorities will be pulling permits, checking property lines. I need to establish alibis for the board. We need a solid cover story for your shoulder. A skiing accident in Aspen, or maybe a car crash on Lakeshore Drive. I can have a fake police report drafted by noon." Dante watched her pace, his dark eyes tracking her manic energy. She was building walls again, constructing elaborate barricades out of spreadsheets, logistics, and perjury. "Tessa." She ignored him, swiping aggressively on the glowing screen. "I also need to cancel your dinner with the senator tomorrow. You can't wear a tailored suit with that dressing. And I should arrange for a deep clean of my apartment. The landlord will ask questions if—" "Tessa, stop." The command wasn't harsh, but it carried enough weight to anchor her feet to the floor. She stopped pacing. She slowly lowered the tablet, her knuckles bone white. She refused to look at him. "I am doing my job," she said. Her voice trembled, betraying the cynical armor she wore so well. Dante leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He gritted his teeth against the sharp pain in his ribs. "Put the tablet down. If I stop working, Dante, I have to think about the fact that I just cleaned human blood off your chest," she snapped, finally looking at him. Her eyes blazed with a messy mix of terror and furious exhaustion. "If I stop working, I have to process the fact that my apartment is destroyed, my quiet life is gone, and I am standing in a $60 million bunker with a man who just blew up a city block. So no, I am not putting the tablet down." Dante didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or attempt to command her again. He simply reached out, his long arm bridging the distance between them, and plucked the expensive device from her rigid grip. He tossed it carelessly onto the velvet sofa. It bounced once and went dark. "Your job is done," he said. Tessa stared at the empty space in her hands. She felt entirely stripped bare, exposed to the elements. "You're firing me." A cold dread pooled in her stomach. If he fired her, she had no protection. She was just a civilian who knew where the bodies were buried. "I'm promoting you," he countered, his voice a low, rough rumble. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, masking the agony radiating from his shattered shoulder. He closed the gap between them, towering over her. The scent of antiseptic, smoke, and sheer predatory dominance enveloped her. "I don't need a secretary anymore," Dante said, looking down into her wide, frightened eyes. "I need a partner. I need someone who doesn't flinch when the room catches fire. Someone who looks at a fractured rib, assesses the damage, and grabs the tape. I manage schedules," she whispered, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "I don't run syndicates. You manage me," he corrected softly. He reached up, his large hands gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, mapping the exhaustion and the stubborn, beautiful resilience in her features. "For 4 years, you've stood behind me. You've cleaned up the messes. You've anticipated the strikes before they happened. You know the beast, Tessa. You know exactly what I am. And you didn't run when the cage finally opened. I didn't have a choice," she lied. Her voice lacked any real conviction. She could have left at the hotel in Chicago. She could have run at the private terminal. She hadn't. "You always have a choice," Dante murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. The heat of his skin radiated into her, grounding her. "Walk out that door right now, and I will hand you a new identity, a passport, and $10 million. You will never see me again. You will be perfectly safe." Tessa closed her eyes. The reality of the offer hung heavy in the air between them. Safety normalcy. A quiet, boring life where the most dangerous thing was a missed quarterly deadline. It was everything she had wanted yesterday. "Or?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. "Or you stay," he rasped, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper against her lips. "You stay, and you stand beside me. Not behind a desk. Not behind a spreadsheet. Beside me. You accept that the violence is part of the contract. You accept that I am a man who will burn the world to keep you warm." He tilted her chin up, forcing her to open her eyes and look at him. The flat, dead stare of the boss was gone. In its place was a naked, terrifying devotion. A hunger that went bone deep. "If I stay," Tessa said, her voice shaking, but her gaze completely unwavering, "I am not fetching your coffee." A low, dark chuckle rumbled deep in Dante's bruised chest, vibrating against her. "I wouldn't dare ask." Tessa looked at the blood staining his knuckles, the bandages wrapping his ruined shoulder. The empire of violence he ruled with an iron fist. It was a cynical, ugly world, devoid of fairy tales and happy endings. But standing in his arms, anchored by his absolute, terrifying loyalty, she knew she had already crossed the point of no return. She didn't need a white knight. She needed a survivor. "Then I guess I need to learn how to shoot," Tessa said quietly. Dante smiled, a sharp, dangerous curve of his mouth. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, punishing kiss that tasted like smoke, blood, and a terrifying, undeniable promise. "I'll buy you a range tomorrow." Gunpowder left a distinct residue. Tessa Hayes scrubbed her hands at the stainless steel sink, watching the grey foam swirl down the drain. Her ears still rang slightly beneath the heavy acoustic dampening of the underground firing range. She dried her hands, inspecting her knuckles. The skin was unbroken. Rossi stood nearby, ejecting the spent magazine from his Sig Sauer. He gave a single approving grunt. 8 consecutive rounds in center mass at 20 yards. It wasn't Olympic accuracy. It was survival accuracy. It was the physical manifestation of the promise Dante had made her in the ruins of their darkest night. She walked out, the heavy steel door sealing behind her, and stepped onto the private elevator. By the time it reached the 52nd floor, the smell of cordite vanished, replaced by the faint scent of vanilla, polished wood, and absolute power. The boardroom was freezing. Dante Costa preferred it that way. It kept the politicians sweating and reminded everyone who controlled the thermostat. Tessa stepped through the double mahogany doors. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her first car. The sensible, apologetic flats of 6 months ago were gone, replaced by stilettos that announced her arrival like a hammer striking an anvil. The low murmur of conversation instantly died. 12 men sat around the polished granite table. Union bosses, city aldermen, 3 lieutenants from the outfits that had absorbed the Morello family after the warehouse burned. At the head of the table, radiating a quiet, lethal gravity, sat Dante. His dark eyes flicked to Tessa as she entered. The corner of his mouth twitched. A fraction of a smile meant only for her. He didn't introduce her. Every man in the city knew exactly who she was now. She wasn't a secretary anymore. She was the ghost in the machine. She was the only person in the Western Hemisphere who could tell Dante Costa no and live to see tomorrow. Tessa walked directly to Dante's side, stopping behind his right shoulder. She placed a single manila folder on the granite table. The slap of cardboard echoed like a gunshot. "Gentlemen," Tessa said, her voice icy and devoid of the frantic exhaustion that used to define her. "We are restructuring the zoning permits for the West Loop casino development." An alderman, a sweating man named Higgins, scoffed nervously. "With all due respect, Ms. Hayes, we had an arrangement. The permits are locked in committee. You can't just walk in here and rewrite a city contract." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rossi shifted his weight by the door. Tessa didn't look at Dante for permission. She looked down at Higgins, opening the folder. She slid a single glossy photograph across the table. Higgins looked down. All the color drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of grey. It was a bank transfer slip, routed through a shell company in Panama, bearing his wife's maiden name. "I don't rewrite contracts, Alderman," Tessa said, her tone sharp as a scalpel. "I enforce compliance. The zoning permits will be approved by Friday morning, or that file gets emailed to a reporter at the Tribune." She tapped the folder with a perfectly manicured nail. "Are we clear?" Higgins swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Dante, silently pleading for intervention. But Dante wasn't looking at the politician. He was looking at Tessa. The sheer pride in his dark eyes was blinding. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together, completely comfortable letting her hold the executioner's axe. "Clear," Higgins choked out, pushing the photo back. "Excellent." Tessa closed the folder. "This meeting is concluded." They filed out quickly, knowing better than to linger. Within 2 minutes, the massive boardroom was entirely empty, save for the two of them. Dante stood up. The imposing height of him still demanded primal respect, but the suffocating terror he used to evoke in her was gone. He walked around the table, sliding his large hand around the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing her jaw with agonizing tenderness. "You enjoyed that," he murmured, his voice dropping into the gravelly register, reserved strictly for locked doors. "He was an arrogant liability," Tessa replied, resting her hands flat against his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart. "He needed to be reminded of his place." Dante chuckled, a dark sound vibrating through her palms. "You're a terrifying woman, Tessa." "You made me this way." "No." He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers, tasting of dark espresso and absolute authority. "I just opened the cage. The teeth were always yours." She kissed him back, letting the cold reality of the boardroom fade. It wasn't a fairy tale. There would be more blood, more threats, more nights spent monitoring scanners while he burned the world down to keep her safe. But as his arms wrapped securely around her waist, she knew she wouldn't trade it. Love in their world wasn't built on soft promises. It was built on survival. And as Dante pulled away, looking at her with fierce devotion, Tessa knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was ruling. What a brutal, beautiful ending to a dark and twisted journey. Tessa didn't just survive Dante's world, she conquered it right beside him. If this gritty, slow-burn Mafia romance kept you hooked, you know exactly what to do. Smash that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel.